I have a theory that sensational posts are more misleading and also that they get more attention on social media. So whenever I'm bored, I'll drop by a subreddit like r psychology and look for highly upvoted posts in the last month, looking for something that's sensational, and I'll look into it to see if I think it's misleading. I think I've found an example here. This post says authoritarian attitudes linked to altered brain anatomy. It makes you think you might be able to detect authoritarians with a brain scan. They have different brains. But I think it's misleading. The title makes this study and their results sound a lot more certain and clear than I think they actually are. I think a better title for this paper would be Exploratory Data Analysis on a Small Non-Representative Subsample Shows Correlations that may or may not be interesting. That this is based on looks at 100 Spanish college students, and they give each student first a survey to ask about their political ideas, and second an MRI to get a picture of the students' brains. And then they try to associate political attitudes with brain structures. Data for the paper is freely available, which is awesome. So I've made some of my own graphs of the paper's data. And the first problem with this paper that I want to point out is that the data is not representative. The students aren't representative of the general population. So the survey asks about political orientation, which ranges from 1, very far left, to 10 on the far right-hand side, meaning very far right. And here we're just seeing the number of students by political orientation. And what you can take away from this is that most of the students are below 5. Most of the students are left-leaning. There's only one student who rated himself a 9, only one student in the 8, 9, 10 category, the far right, we might say, compared to 53 students in the far left, 1, 2, and 3 category. So you can see the problem. This is a very left-leaning sample, which you might expect from college students. And if your paper is going to tell me about the brain architectures of right-leaning people, it seems like a problem that you may only have one far right person. Right-wing authoritarianism is not the same thing as being right-wing. Right-wing authoritarianism has 3 dimensions. First is authoritarian aggression, so that's like being able to hurt or harm other people if the authorities say it's okay. Second is authoritarian submission, meaning you defer to the proper authorities and think they should be given a lot of trust and you don't need to question them and so on. And finally, conventionalism, which is strongly accepting the mainstream social roles of society. Really the case that right-wing authoritarianism is associated with being right-wing. So here we're back to a graph I made from their data. And what we're looking at is the right-wing authoritarianism percentage in blue by political orientation. That's that same 1 to 10 scale. And my takeaway here is that you don't get more right-wing authoritarian as you go right. So political orientations 1 to 4, they're all kind of the same right-wing authoritarian. Political orientations 5 and 6 are centrist, 5, and 6, those are elevated relative to 1 to 4. But by the time we're at 7, we're back down, kind of a similar number to 1 to 4. And then after 7, remember, we only have one person for these 3 numbers, so not enough data. Left-wing authoritarianism has 3 different principles too. Anti-hierarchical aggression is the idea of being violent or resisting the current structures of authority and power in society. Anti-conventionalism is moral superiority and ideological uniformity within the group. And top-down censorship is the idea that people in the group can coerce and punish people in order to enforce the same ideology within the group. And left-wing authoritarianism, in red, is associated with being left-wing. You can see it decreases as you go right. And also, the scores for left-wing authoritarianism are a lot higher than the scores for right-wing authoritarianism for most of the students. So that's the non-representative part of my criticism. You're going to tell me about right-wing brains based off of brain scans of left-wing, left authoritarians. And also, by the way, right-wing authoritarianism, that's not the same thing as right-wing politics. And some of the conclusions, I think, are doubtful. For example, the Reddit post says left-wing authoritarianism was linked to reduced cortical thickness in some brain areas. Table 4 of the paper, they're looking at cortical thickness and other things. And you can see that what they're doing, they have these 8 different political attitudes and 4 different brain measurements. And then they're just finding the correlations between all of them. So they have 32 different correlations. And they've marked 2 of the correlations with a single asterisk, meaning a p-value between 0.01 and 0.05. The p-value is the probability of getting a result as or more extreme than the result that you actually got if the null hypothesis were true. That is, if there were no relationship between cortical thickness and left-wing authoritarian anti-hierarchical aggression. So you're saying, look at this inverse correlation between cortical thickness and left-wing authoritarian anti-hierarchical aggression. Because the p-value is less than 0.05, there's only a 5% chance of obtaining results as or more extreme than this if there were no relationship between the 2 of those things. But the problem is, if you're doing 32 correlations, you would expect 5% of those 32 correlations to have a p-value below 0.05 simply by chance, by coincidence. If the null hypothesis is true, then p-values are uniformly distributed. Any p-value is equal to any other, is as likely as any other. And it's also the case that if there were a real relationship here, and your study was sufficiently powered to detect it, then I would expect the p-value would actually be a lot less than 0.01. I have a video in a playlist titled P-values that explains why that's true. So this looks just like a coincidence to me. I don't look at this table and think, oh, if you are anti-hierarchical aggressive, then you probably have reduced thickness in your ventromedial prefrontal cortex. I think, well, you did 32 correlations and 2 of them were randomly statistically significant, so that's probably just a coincidence. Overall, this is an exploratory paper. The authors describe it that way. They didn't pre-register anything. They didn't say, we're looking for this specific relationship. Instead, they had a relatively small 100 college students. They had a relatively small non-representative sample, and they just explored the data that they had available, looking for correlations between brain volumes and political attitudes, measurements on their survey. I mentioned prior research in Singapore, which did a similar thing with just right-wing authoritarians. And the Singaporean study found a different relationship than what this paper purports to find. And so that makes me skeptical that the results of the paper are generalizable. If someone else has done a similar study and found a different result, well, maybe that kind of means you can't reproduce your results, or that your results don't extend past the set of people who are represented by your sample. I really enjoyed reading this paper, and I love that they shared their data. It's open access, so anyone can download it and explore it, and I think that's very cool and useful. But having read the paper and explored the data some myself, I'm not at all left with the impression that there are reliable differences in brain anatomy between right-wing and left-wing authoritarians. And actually, I'm a little skeptical even of the construct of right-wing authoritarianism, given that it's not really associated, at least in this sample, with actually being right-wing. So I think a better title would have been something like, in a small non-representative sample, we found potential correlations between certain political attitudes and brain structures that another group didn't reproduce. And maybe this will be interesting going forward. I think that would have been a better title, but probably would have gotten fewer upvotes on Reddit. So thanks for your time.